Hi everyone, welcome to this new episode of Exploring Field Gemology with GIA. It's the fourth episode in our series. We still have one, and we're going to invite our guest very shortly, Wim Vertriest. I'm just going to wait a bit. If you haven't watched the first three episodes, they're all in a reel section of this account, Rapaport Jewelry Pro. They're also on our YouTube channel, so you have plenty of occasion to catch up. Here we are. How are you?
There we are.
So great to have you back. I'm just going to say it again. We are going live with Wim Vertriest from the GIA, Gemological Institute of America in Bangkok to talk field gemology. And this is the fourth episode of our series, and its Instagram Live is brought to you by the GIA, which has been protecting consumers and supporting the global gem and jewelry trade since 1931 through research, education, and laboratory services. So we were very lucky. We've already explored a lot of things in field gemology in our first three episodes. As I've said, you can catch up. So happy people are joining us. Please tell us where you're joining us from. And I'm going to say it. I have some questions for Wim, but we welcome all your questions. It's super important. It's really an educational session of roughly an hour. We're extremely lucky to have him to share all this. So thank you. Tell us where you're from. That's fantastic. So we have people from Ethiopia, Toronto, New York. Hi, Sharon. Oh, that's an interesting question that we'll keep for the end. Why is the GI Mumbai so far from GI Carlsbad? I think it's geography, but we can tackle this one at the end. We keep it as a bonus question for them. Bucharest, Lebanon, I love it. We have people from really all over the world with us. Sierra Leone, Bharat, amazing. Kenya. Thank you everyone for joining us. And please ask questions either in this feed, but because there are a lot of talk and a lot of chat, there's also dedicated question space at the bottom of your screen. So if you type your question there, it's actually a bit easier for us to make sure that we ask the question to them. Can you tell us a bit more what we've been talking about the last three episodes?
Yeah, perfect. So my job here at GIA in Bangkok is the manager of field gemology. We've taken the time to really explore what field gemology means and why everyone should care about it. So we basically started with explaining that for me, field gemology is based on these four pillars. There are obviously the gems themselves, which we need to understand. But then there's also the mining of the gemstones that we need to understand. Because if we understand the mining better, then we will understand, for example, the environmental impact better. We will understand why certain stones don't come from certain places. If we understand the mining and the geology, it kind of makes sense that we get a lot of emeralds from Colombia, but that there's no sapphires associated with it. Or if we understand that mining, we know why the rough crystals from Sri Lanka, for example, look a little bit different from the rough crystals that we get from Myanmar. So that's why the understanding that mining is so important. Now, another thing that we talked about is we need to understand the gemstones themselves. So I think that's what we talked about last time. And that also understanding the culture and the people around it. We all know that, for example, Sri Lanka is very important for sapphires. But do we know why? Because if we understand, for example, that Burma has 2,000 years of history in rupee mining, then we know that that holds a lot of value. That is an important part of that story. So understanding that culture, what ruby means in Burmese society, that is something that is also a very important part of field gemology. If we understand what diamonds mean in the Indian society, what the role of emeralds is in Indian jewelry, and why there are no, I think this is an example that we brought up last time, for example, because we talked like the week after the big Ambani wedding, and that we saw a lot of crazy and incredible diamonds and emeralds, but no sapphires. So understanding that culture behind it, understanding the people and what that means for it is also a part of field gemology. So that's field gemology that's not super technical. That's not really for the lab. It's not going to influence the way that GI makes reports, but it's very important for everyone who works with gemstones that you get a better understanding of that. And now I think there's the fourth pillar, the one that we're going to focus on today, and that is how gemstones get traded. How do stones end up from a mine in Tanzania in a high jewelry store in Shanghai? because there's a lot of people involved between it. I think if we appreciate, understand, and acknowledge all those steps in between, then we can obviously understand the whole story of our gemstone a lot better. Now, when I talk about gemstones, I'm based in Bangkok, so that kind of gave it away already that we're going to be talking only about colored gemstones. So I think diamond trading and the way that the diamond industry operates is very different. There are some parallels happening there, but I think all the examples that we're going to bring up are going to be colored stone related. So we're going to talk a lot about rubies, sapphires, emeralds, spinel, tourmalines, while diamonds usually follows its own path, which is its own expertise that I'm not super familiar with.
Fantastic. Let's get started. So as I said, you can watch the previous episodes on this channel and also on our YouTube channel. Last time, Wim told us about the instruments that he uses in field gemology. That was super interesting. So if you're a student of gemology and interested, that was great on top of it. And I didn't introduce myself, but I'm Sonia Esther Soltani and I'm a contributing editor at Rapaport. So now that we've done the administration, let's get started. This live is also for retailers, designers, jewelers, and in mind, we think about the end consumer, the person buying that ring, that dream ring, this emotional piece that they're going to cherish. So why is it important to know the mind to market journey of the gemstones?
Well, yeah, I think the whole part of field gemology, not only understanding how it goes from the mine to the finished product, but also how the mining has happened, how that gem is approached in the field, and how the local people, all the people that work with it, whether it is in the cutting center, whether it is in the mining communities, that we understand what all these people contribute. Because intuitively, we all understand that there is more about gemstones than having the biggest, the cleanest, the brightest color gemstone. We all intuitively feel that there is a bigger story. And a big part of that story is where that stone comes from, but also how that stone has been worked. Who are the communities that have been working with it? How does it go from one place to another? And I think these are things that not a lot of people know about. But I think if we get more appreciation for it, if we understand more how gemstones have traveled through the world and how much expertise from different international communities goes into converting that rough stone that might have been mined somewhere in an extremely remote place into a very fine jewelry piece. I think if we understand that better, we will get a better appreciation for any kind of gemstone. So I think we will focus a lot about what happens with a gemstone before it is cut. I think that's mostly what we're going to be talking about. Because frankly, if we want to know what happens to a gemstone after it's cut, the jewelry manufacturing products, procedures, there's entire libraries dedicated to it. But how a stone goes from rough to cut, that is very often a little bit of a mystery for most people. So that's why I want to have this whole discussion today, where these things come from, how they get turned from rough to cut, who are the people involved there, and just shine a little bit of a light into all of that.
Great. And also, I think the difference that we've seen before is obviously you have different types of mining, and that's going to affect the way the stone enters the pipeline and its journey. So let's say you start in the artisanal mining. That a lot of people are saying found romantic from afar, but we've tackled that. There's a lot of dangers, difficulties, challenges, and it's a very hard place as well. But when you're respectful of the local communities, it can produce amazing things. So how does it start from the artisanal mining up to the manufacturing? What would be the chain of the little steps?
Artisanal mining, I think, is something that is very underrated. I think even to this day, the vast majority of colored stones are coming from artisanal miner. Although I think in terms of value, that number is decreasing, where we see more large-scale operations coming that are bringing products to the market in a formalized way. So artisanal mining is usually people that are working at a very small scale. These are people that are working with very simple tools, low impact, very low investment. Quite literally, this could be a couple of people with some shovels working in the river. So these are not people that are able to drill shafts, go underground. These are people using very simple tools. So artisanal mining versus small scale mining versus large scale mining is very difficult. Now, depending on the place where this happens, these artisanal miners can be formalized or more informal. In some places, there are structures where these people actually can register and are a little bit protected and known. But in most places, these people are unlicensed. In a lot of cases, these people are actually not professional miners, are more seasonal workers. For example, if you go up to Vietnam, to northern Vietnam, where there is a lot of ruby and spinel mining, those places, a lot of the people working in the mines there are actually rice farmers. But while there is less work in the rice farms, they are able to supplement their income by working some of the old ruby deposits, and they're finding rubies, spinels in the rivers. Now, obviously, when there is enough money to be made there, that allows for some people to transition to full-time mining. And then it can go a step further into small-scale mining, where these people maybe get a little bit of investment, are able to get some heavier equipment, something like an excavator, or a compressor, or a pump, or a pulsating jig, which is an instrument that is used to basically sort gravels based on the density. So the heavier minerals concentrate, and the heavier minerals are usually the gem varieties. So it really depends on the exact location, but usually there are markets in the nearby area where these people are able to sell their stones. So there are local dealers that are either going around to these artisanal miners and paying them to actually collect the goods that they produce, the full mine run. But in some places that gets a little bit trickier. So it's not always possible to have a larger scale market. And very often, especially in remote areas in Africa, they are relying on what we refer to as like bush brokers. These are people that spend months on end in the deep forest, deep bush in Africa, connecting with these communities, putting a lot of things on the line, traveling in dangerous circumstances, living in dangerous environments, exposing themselves for a long time to tropical diseases and whatnot, to be able to collect enough volume from these artisanal miners to be able to bring those parcels that are then a little bit color sorted or clarity graded or based on size, and bring that to some of the larger marketplaces. For example, in Tanzania, a lot of those rough gemstones accumulate in the city of Arusha. But some of these gemstones are mined 3,000 kilometers away from it. So they have traveled through a network of bush brokers, where in Africa, a lot of these people have roots in the West African communities, which is something that a lot of people try to generalize, where they think, okay, these are just African brokers. But actually, the people from West Africa with a very strong tribal background from the Mandinka people, these are the descendants of the ancient Mali Empire that was ruled a couple of hundred years ago by the richest man who ever lived, Mansa Musa. So these people have a rich history in precious goods trading. And a lot of these men, a lot of these families have spread out contacts all throughout Africa into the mines to connect with these people there, and are traveling intensely and bringing the rough to the local markets, but even to the artisanal markets. They are sometimes compiling these parcels in Africa and bringing them to, for example, Thailand, where there is a lot of manufacturing demand for these materials, or to Sri Lanka, or to Germany, to the cutting centers in Idar Oberstein. So these people very often have very long tentacles that stretch all the way from their homeland in Guinea, Mali, all the way to Madagascar, which is, we think Africa is a small place, but that's 7,000 kilometers away. So these networks covers huge distances, and these people take incredible risks. And it is only because of their community that they're able to take these risks. So the rough trading business is something very complex to understand.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't really know that. Now, that applies for mostly artisanal mining in Africa, but if you look at artisanal mining in Asia, for example, it goes very different. For example, if we take the example of Mogok in Myanmar, one of the most famous colored gemstone areas in the world, there is a very clear trajectory on how stones can reach the market. And over the centuries, systems have developed there that allow the whole community to share in it. So the larger companies, they are able to process the goods. So they mine at a larger scale. They dig tunnels, process that material, but they have a custom that is called the Kanase custom, which means that everything that is discarded by these larger mines, by these mines that have more investment, that maybe work with excavators, that maybe dig in tunnels, that have crushers, all the material they discard, all the material they reject becomes common property, which means that everyone can go through it and can find the small gemstones. Because very often for these large-scale companies, it's not really worth it to chase those small rubies or the small spinels. They are after the big ones. But there are a lot of these small ones out there, and because they are discarded, they are communal property, people can use very simple tools to actually go after that and actually supplement their income or even build a complete income on the material that's been rejected by these larger mines. So it really varies on the location. I think for artisanal and small scale mining, it is a lot more tricky than people realize to understand how these stones get from point A to point B and the risks that are involved there. But it is these people that are critical in making sure that these discoveries reach the international trade, that these stones that maybe someone somewhere finds and thinks it is valuable, to make sure that this ends up with the right people takes a lot of pieces of the puzzle that have to click together. And a lot of these bush brokers, a lot of these rough brokers that are connecting the mine to the manufacturers, they are very often overlooked in the whole trade.
That's great. I think that was a great overview, but we're going to take a little stop in our pipeline journey. Now that's it, we've moved from the mine, we're going to the next stage. And I would like to encourage everyone, please, it's really a great opportunity to ask questions related to gemstones, field gemology, to Wim, our guest today, Wim Vertriest from the GIA. That's actually, we have a question that we're going to ask. So the rough have arrived. What is the next stage in the cutting center and the trading center?
Exactly. One thing that we all have to realize is when material comes out of the mine or when material leaves the mine and goes to the next step, the vast majority of that material is not readily usable. And I think, for example, maybe only 1% of the product that is produced, 1% of the spinel or the ruby, is actually going to be of fine gem quality as is. And building a system that can live up that 1% is not always sustainable. That is actually pretty challenging. Which means that if you want to buy rough, if you want to work with rough, one of the most important things to understand is actually treatment of gemstones. And that is something that a lot of people look down on treatment. They think, oh, treated stones, I don't want to deal with this, or this is bad, these are inferior stones. I think that is a terrible attitude. Heat treatment or any kind of treatment is often necessary to keep any gemstone alive. In fact, you could make the statement that fine untreated gems are a byproduct of treated gemstones. Because if you are able to successfully treat materials, treat some of the material that is not perfect as it is, the B grade material, which is maybe 10% of the volume, if you are able to treat that and turn it into a beautiful gemstone that you can still bring to the market, you are able to work with so much more material from the mine. So understanding treatment, what are the points in the stone that you can improve, is an extremely important part of understanding rough gemstones.
Some people are saying it's a very good point. The treatment is important in some stones. Just to be sure I got it right, and in case anyone else has this question, are we talking treatment of the 1% that is gem quality, or are we talking treatment of some of the rest that is not gem quality to bring it to a better level?
Good that you bring that up, that wasn't clear. So we could say that maybe 1% of the gemstones that are coming out, they're going to be super fine gems in an untreated state. But you need that next step, so not the top, but like everything below that, that is something that you often need to heat treat. Maybe the color is a little bit too dark. Maybe the clarity isn't perfect. For example, in emerald production, the amount of clean emeralds that come out of an emerald mine are teeny tiny. But because you're able to fracture fill all that fractured material, you can actually bring it up to a higher quality. And you're able to bring more and more material to the market. So I think that's something that we cannot overlook, that we are able to improve a lot of the material from a mine, and that could really determine the success of a mine. There are examples of mines that produce some of the most incredible, fantastic gemstones, but because it was such a tiny production of the mine, and the rest of that production could not be improved with heat treatment, that those mines had to close. And an example that we can give from that are the Winza ruby mines in central Tanzania, which produce some of the most incredible rubies. And I think even now, if you go to the big ruby houses and the big people who are working with rubies, if you ask them what some of the finest rubies were, a lot of them will mention Winza. But the Winza material, the top 1% that came out as untreated super fine, they were exquisite. But all the rest of the material could not really be improved, which means that a lot of that material was actually worthless. There was no market for it. And those very few fine gemstones were not sufficient to keep that mine running. So that's why understanding treatment, how much of the material that is not attractive at first sight could be made attractive, improving the color or improving the clarity, because I think those are usually the two issues that we have. And we could take this to a very extreme level. These could be very drastic treatments like glass filling of ruby, or could be as simple as heat treatment of some rubies where we just improve the color a little bit. But understanding that is something that is very important if you want to understand how rough moves to a cut stone.
And who makes that decision? Is it the people bringing the rough to the market, or is it the cutters, or is it already people who've put an option on the rough?
Usually these are the people that are doing, I usually refer to them as manufacturing, because the people that do the treatment and the cutting are usually the same people. I'm going to bring in, because we talked a little bit about artisanal mining, but this whole story works for large-scale mining as well. So there's a lot, I mentioned already that there's a lot more large-scale mining going on in colored stones. And large-scale mining is very relative, especially compared to diamond mines. The biggest colored stone large-scale miners are peanuts compared to the average diamond mining operation. But still, we see a lot more of these, maybe I should refer to them more as fully integrated or more integrated mines, where they have a structured material to bring their production to markets. That could mean you either bring the rough to markets, or you could even bring the finished goods to markets. There are a lot of mines that have experimented with both models. For example, I think a lot of the Montana sapphire miners are mining the material, marketing the material, and also cutting some of it in-house and selling it themselves as cut gemstones. And the other part sold as rough. The big ruby miners and emerald miners in the world, they are usually mining the material, sorting the rough material, and then bringing it to auction, selling it to the manufacturers that are interested in it. But if you go to, for example, the ruby auctions, the people that are involved in buying there usually consist of teams. You have the company owner, who will decide about the money. And then there is very often he brings two other experts with him that work for his factory. One of them is the heat treater, who says, I can turn this color into a slightly better color. And then he brings the cutter with him, who can say, I can cut this stone into a 2-carat cushion or a 3-carat pear shape. And then the owner makes those decisions of like, okay, if we improve this color to a slightly more vivid red and I make a 3-carat pear shape out of it, then I can sell for this much money, which is reflected in how much money he can pay for that rough. But having that idea of how much a stone can be improved in terms of color clarity is a very important aspect of that equation. So that's why a lot of time a deep understanding of treatment is very important. And also, if certain rough isn't able to treat, that could basically be a death sentence for some mines. I've given the example of Winza ruby. Another example is a lesser known, was a very cool material. It was pinkish spinel coming out of northern Mozambique, but it was very cloudy. So that cloudiness, you try to reduce that by heat treating it, because in spinel, some of that cloudiness can start dissolving when you take it over to higher temperatures. But it didn't work on this material, which means that that mine just stopped producing because the people that were buying it couldn't improve the material, which means that they were no longer interested in it, which means that there's no incentive for the artisanal miners to keep working it. So there's a very intense feedback between material being able to heat treat or other treats. I talk heat treat because most of the work I do is with corundum, where heat treatment is the most common treatment. The amount of material that can be treated gives a very strong feedback on how a mine is developed. For example, one of the factors that contributed to the success of Mozambican ruby is that, first of all, there is a huge amount of it easy to mine, but there's also a huge amount of material that doesn't need to be treated, but all the material that needs a little bit of improvement reacts extremely well to all the known recipes for improvement, which means that the amount of gem quality material that you can get from that deposit is unbelievable. So those are always very interesting things, and I think these things could change over time. For example, if there is a new treatment coming out, people might go back to a certain place because material that didn't react to the known recipes maybe react to the new recipes. One example are some of the smaller Thai sapphire mines in eastern Thailand, where a lot of the production were green sapphires that were not super attractive. But when about 20 years ago, they discovered beryllium diffusion, which is a treatment that can help drastically change the color in certain sapphires. They discovered that these greens with that beryllium diffusion could turn into very rich golden yellow sapphires, which suddenly made these green stones very attractive. Not because everybody wanted green stones, because people were able to turn those green stones into very nice golden yellows.
I think that's such an important thing. We've been talking about treatment, and we said some people don't want to talk about treatments, but one of our community members, Lydia, was saying it's quite accepted that certain stones can only arrive on the market for the end consumer in a beautiful color. You mentioned a beautiful yellow. People are familiar with emerald, obviously, or rubies. And it's very interesting where you just outlined how treatments is actually saving mines sometimes, and the livelihood of miners. We took it from the mine to the treatment to the rough to the manufacturer, but actually it benefits the source of the stones themselves. And I think that's so interesting to look at treatment in that perspective as well.
Absolutely. Like these things, they're very closely coupled, and there's very intense feedback going on between those, to the fact that the absence of a treatment could basically kill a mine or kill a deposit because we're not able to improve this, but also the resurgence of a new treatment could actually elevate a new mine, or could really cause the rebirth of a certain mine, for example. That just stresses how important treatment of gemstones is in that whole evaluation cycle, going from how that rough is coupled with the manufacturing. Because a critical step in that manufacturing process is the treatment of stones. Like, a lot of people don't want to talk about it, but treatment of stones is probably the most driving factor in the gemstone industry. If we take away, especially in colored stones, if we take away all the treated stones, the market would collapse, because very often these treated stones are funding the findings of the very fine untreated stones, where I think I mentioned this before, that we could consider the fine untreated stones as a byproduct of mining for stones that need treatment.
Fantastic. Such an important point for people who are listening to us, wherever you are in the pipeline. I think that was a great point. And I think someone else in our chat mentioned something about detection, because that's what we're talking about: mine to market, full disclosure, what's happening, where stones are coming from. And someone says some of the low heat treatments are not detectable.
Well, that is low temperature treatment of corundum is a whole other discussion that gets very technical and very complex. But it is kind of a hot topic, quite literally, but not that hot, especially now anymore. Yeah, so low temperature treatment basically means that we treat corundum them, so rubies and sapphires, at a temperature that is lower than the conventional treatment. So usually these are treated at very extreme temperatures, over 1300 Celsius, which means that it's going to have a very drastic impact on the inclusion scene, which means that it's very easy to detect. Now, that low temperature treatment stays at much lower temperatures. I think you can push it. We've done experiments where we have seen some changes as low as 600 Celsius. So a lot lower, and that obviously is going to have a lot smaller impact on the inclusion scene, which makes it a lot harder to detect. Now, I especially say it makes it a lot harder to detect because right now we are able to detect this. We have done a huge amount of research where at GIA we have treated a lot of stones at low temperature that we have documented before and after, and we are able to use that to distill criteria that we are able to recognize this is how a stone is low temperature treated, and these are the minimal, the subtle impacts that it has on inclusions that a lot of people might overlook, but we know what we're looking for. There's still a lot of confusion about that in the trade, where that low temperature treatment is not very well understood, and I think a lot of more classically trained gemologists are not familiar with the criteria that you need to use to identify it, so they very often overlook it. So in that regard, there is still a lot of education going on. I think GIA is offering that education. I have taught numerous low temperature treatment detection seminars for GIA, and I think there is even a self-paced class on GIA's website where you can learn what it means for a stone to be low temperature treatment, but also learn some of the aspects of how you can detect it using the microscope. Now, obviously, we also rely for a certain degree on more advanced instrumentology that maybe not everyone has available, but a microscope is still going to be your best friend. But you're right, it is a lot harder to detect, but it is not an impossible thing to do.
Great. So for people who are joining us now, we are almost halfway, a bit more of our conversation is exploring field gemology as part of a series sponsored by the GIA. Our guest is Wim Vertriest from Bangkok, the manager for field gemology. And what we're exploring today is the mine to market journey of color gemstones. We're not covering diamonds today. I know you're on the Rapaport channel, but you're GIA, yep. So it's just color gemstones. And you mentioned something which I think, we need to talk money at some stage. I know you're not a money man, you're the explorer, but I think that's something that obviously for our audience is interesting to know because, as you mentioned, auction, selling, buying, sourcing. So how does the value of the stone evolve along the pipeline from the mine to the moment where it's going to be auctioned?
It's a very interesting thing to look at, and it's often quite complex to assess that because a lot of these steps are very untransparent. We barely even know where these people are from, who they are, how they are trading, but we can assume that it's an order of magnitudes of difference when it goes from the mine to the actual finished product. And that can be explained by a number of reasons. I think in a lot of places with a lot of people, there are so many people involved that all bring their own skill set, that all take their own risks, that all need to make a living on these stones, that the value added through every step obviously means a significant increase in price. Now, where those biggest steps are, that is hard to say. A lot of people consider that the step from where the stone gets cut is actually the biggest step of where value is added. I think that's a difficult statement. So when the stone actually goes from rough to cut, so not when the rough goes, for example, from the mine in Colombia to a trader in Colombia or to a manufacturer in Colombia, not when a parcel of gardens goes from a mine in Tanzania to a bush broker, or from a bush broker to a broker in the city, or from that broker to an international broker. A lot of people consider that most of the value gets added when that rough is actually turned into a faceted stone. Now, in my opinion, there are two ways that you can explain it. The first one is they actually add most of the value, or the people that are turning the rough into the cut are actually getting the rough way too cheap. So the more I've been around, the more I lean towards that second thing, where I actually think that rough gemstones are still very cheap, and that the value that is added by turning them from a rough to a polished stone is actually a lot smaller than most people think. There is a huge surcharge there. So I don't fully understand how all of it works, but I think we all know that there are huge increases in value during every step of the chain, but that is only in the price paid for gemstones, because a lot of that is also reflected in the cost of time and the monetary cost in being able to source these materials. I was talking with a guy once, and he said we were looking at blue sapphires, and the price that was quoted to him, we're in Hong Kong or in Tucson, was $800 a carat. Or with a Sri Lankan dealer, and he came back with the argument, but I can get them for $600 in Sri Lanka. To which I think the easiest answer is, well, go sit in Sri Lanka, get the plane ticket there, pay for the hotel, and go sit there for 3 weeks and go pay 600. Because if you can make the math work, yes, maybe it's to your benefit. But most likely you're not going to be able to actually make those numbers work, because the people that are able to successfully buy at the sources, whether it is cut or rough, they often have a very valuable skill set, or they dedicate a lot of time to it. So that is something that a lot of people also overlook. And I think that is something that we have to acknowledge. The price and the convenience of having access to these things, that comes at a cost. If you don't have to travel all the way to a mine in Tanzania, and I got back last week from East Africa, and I can tell you, visiting some of these mines, it is not an easy thing. If you are able to take your tanzanites directly from the ground yourself, they will cost less money than what you will pay them when you buy them on a cruise ship. But do you want to go 300 meters underground and dig for 3 months without finding a single crystal?
Or do you prefer to be on a cruise ship with your cocktail in the Caribbean?
Exactly. So I think that's something that a lot of people also overlook, because it is a very easy thing to overlook. And it's not really ignoring, I think it's more overlooking, because I think most people know this, but they conveniently forget about it, is that the amount of work that goes into it to go to these places, sit there, work there, wait for it, maybe not get anything, take a huge risk. Some of these guys that spend months out in the bush trying to buy there from the artisanal miners, it's a huge risk they're taking. Massive safety concerns, tropical diseases. Maybe there's no stones coming. Maybe they get cheated. So they have to be covered for all of that. And I think a lot of that adds to the value of the rough that a lot of people don't realize. And then obviously, I think when we go to the last steps in the jewelry manufacturing, we don't have to lecture the jewelers in the world on how they can create value in their material. They're the absolute masters of it. But very similar things are happening throughout all that supply chain that we very often overlook out of convenience.
I love that. And I think it's so important. And I think someone said, it's such an important thing to share with your end clients if they're interested in a journey. Some of them are not potentially interested. They just want a beautiful tanzanite. They fall in love with it. It's beautiful. It's a gift. It's for themselves or for someone. But if you can share the beginning of the journey and all the risk, all the hard work that goes into sourcing this stone, that's, I think, also a great sell pitch. Someone asked us where they can watch this recording. It will be saved on his channel on Rapaport Jewelry Pro Instagram account in the Reel section, also on the YouTube section. So if you've missed the beginning, please, you can watch it at your convenience a bit later. Something has come up a lot in the chat, and I see it in questions as well, but I would just like to say something, Wim, that I felt so much, and I appreciate the beauty and the rarity of colored gemstones, but I think what we've seen in the series, the 4th episode, is really how much hard work goes into the mine to the market, how much, all the people involved at every stage of the way, the risk they take, if it's physical, if it's financial, if it's every single thing they do to make sure that this stone will reach the end consumer and charm the end consumer and be of meaning, I think has been absolutely fascinating. So if you haven't watched the 1st episode, please do, because I think Wim has been amazing at conveying this and really taking us behind the scenes of this journey. There's one question that has come up a lot in different shape and form, so I hope I'm doing justice to the people who asked it. Some people said lab-grown colored gemstones, are they entering the market at this stage? And also because some of them are not able to replicate the natural stone, does it mean that it's not a concern in that part of the journey?
I think a lot of these questions coming nowadays from people with a strong diamond background, because right now the diamond industry is facing the whole issue of lab-grown, man-made, factory-made diamonds is very big right now. I think in colored stones, we kind of had a phase like that too, but that phase is about 30 years behind us. I think we have seen a lot of synthetic emeralds, sapphires, rubies being made, but that was very popular in the 80s, 90s. I'm going to say mostly the 80s, where they were very common. And I think today they are still very common, but there are very little issues with it in the trade. They are readily recognizable if you know what to look for. Any trained gemologist should have a very strong background in detecting lab-grown synthetic rubies and sapphires and emeralds. For example, in the GIA graduate gemologist degree, there is a very strong focus on separating synthetic colored stones from natural colored stones. Because, yes, it is an important distinction to make, and it can be a quite costly distinction to make. Now, these materials, the most of them that you see being traded, they are very openly disclosed. There is a huge market for synthetic emeralds, for lab-grown rubies, but there are reasons for it. Whether you agree with those reasons or not, they are just very price efficient. They are very attractive in terms of pricing for a lot of people that use the lapidary arts as a more of an artistic expression. That rough comes cheap. You can do incredible things with it. So with a larger piece at lower cost, that these are super interesting materials. So most of the manufacturers, most of the people working with synthetic colored cells are extremely open about the fact that these are synthetics. They are not trying to pass these off as the same thing. Now, there are exceptions. Is and always will be cheaters. There are people who want to make some quick money. So another thing that as a rough buyer you have to be very aware is that yes, maybe someone has slipped in some imitations, some synthetics. So these things do happen around the mines. And in fact, the closer to the mine you get, the costlier that mistake could be. And actually, the more likely you are to see it. Because you are at the first stage, the more people that have handled this, the more chances it is that it has been screened out by them. If you are the seventh person to go through a parcel, yeah, maybe someone else has already seen, okay, this one is really off. This is probably a synthetic. But if you go closer to the mines, you might get fooled a lot more. For example, when I was in Tanzania 10 days ago, I was buying at a village next to the mine from brokers that bought directly from the miners. There was one piece of glass this size in there, which obviously very easy to recognize for me because I'm a trained gemologist, but maybe not everyone is able to realize that. And that could be a quite costly mistake. To a similar degree where I have seen very terrible imitation stones where people have melted pieces of blue plastic onto a rock and tried to sell them to me as sapphires in host rock. I actually bought that one because it was so bad that I wanted to have it. But for example, in the markets in Vietnam, I have encountered synthetic spinel mixed into blue spinel parcels, which can be very tricky to identify. So yes, synthetics, you have to be aware of them, and they can be very costly mistakes in the rough buying process, but they're not very common. So it's not unheard of, but it's not a routine issue. But it's something that as a rough buyer, you have to be very aware of and really be educated in those fields as well.
Absolutely. And I hope this series has helped people in clarifying so many things or opening questions that you can explore further with the GIA. They mentioned there are a lot of courses available at the GIA in person, online. So I really encourage anyone who wants to learn more to do it with a reputable institution and, who has an amazing reference library and in stones, and also the instructors who are the top class people in their field. Before we wrap it up, I'm going to check if there's any question there, because some of them you already covered them in our conversation. I saw that someone was thanking you for sharing your knowledge, and it was very interesting. I think there's a general feeling.
I see a question coming in here about specific kinds of stones, specific variety of sapphire. So I think the Zawadi sapphire, this is a kind of sapphire that is a very peculiar color, usually due to its very heavy inclusion scenes, which makes it very difficult to replicate that in the lab. So you can make sapphires of any kind of variety in a laboratory, but a very included one, an iron-rich one, is a difficult one to make. That variety of sapphire that we're talking about here also doesn't react very well to heat treatments because it is already very included. But I think it is a nice case study about another method of valuing material that at first sight is not the most attractive. Because Zawadi sapphire is not the classic, or there are other names for gold sheen sapphire, I think. This is a material that's not your typical sapphire. These are not your transparent faceted blue. These are usually translucent to opaque materials with a more bronzy color, sometimes blue, green, or yellow overtones, but with very unusual reflections in it that often remind us even a little bit of labradorite. So very unusual sapphires, but they are able to give it a very peculiar story, a very interesting spin to it, and able to turn it into a very unusual product, which creates its own niche, which actually creates a market for this material. So that's also something that can be done. Even if it is not your standard material that the market demands, you could actually try and market it as another kind of product, which is something that for these sapphires has worked to a certain degree pretty well.
Great. I hope it answers the question of the member of audience. We have a question here from Dr. Sharon Novak. What wouldn't the cloudiness in a Mozambique pink spinel alleviate with heating? Is it caused by a different trace mineral than typically found in spinels? What is the issue? Thank you.
Well, spinel heat treatment is done not to improve the color. The color in spinel does not improve with heat treatment. The only part of spinel that improves during heat treatment is its clarity. So some spinel, especially the ones from Tanzania, they are a little bit cloudy. They have very fine particles throughout it. And during heat treatment, these particles can dissolve and actually make the stone more transparent. So people try to do the same thing with that Mozambican variety. But I think the problem is there is just too much of that fine particle in there. The cloud is just too dense, which means that there's only a limit of how much you can burn away. So I think there's just too much in that Mozambican spinel that even if you take away maybe half of it, you're still going to have a certain degree of cloudiness. While in the Tanzanian material, you are usually able to get rid of almost all of it. So I think that's where the main difference is, but maybe they just didn't have the correct recipe. Maybe if you cook it longer, maybe if you heat it a little bit at a higher temperature, you might be able to figure it out. But people working with it were not able to figure it out and turned to other products to continue their gem business.
Very interesting. It just also reminds us every single time, each stone is so specific. There's no one fit all recipe. There's not like a trick that makes everything, different quality. So I think that is a great reminder here. And on two specific examples, the sapphire and the spinel from Mozambique or Tanzania. We're going to wrap it up. Someone asked us when is the next live, and the topic, it will be announced shortly. It will be, we have one last episode. Wim and I would welcome your feedback. If there's a topic that you would like us to do for the last episode of this series, Exploring Field Gemology with the GIA, that would be amazing. If you send us messages in his inbox, Wim Instagram as well. And if you follow Wim, you will follow him in Africa and you'll see a lot of adventures and behind the scenes. I really enjoyed the travelogue.
I think the last episode that we're going to do is where we're going to focus really on the cultures and the people that are involved with the mining. So I think if you guys have questions or I want to know specifically more about the Colombian emerald miners or the Burmese ruby cutters, things like that would be super helpful, because then we can really focus on specific stories and we can prepare that a little bit more and go a little bit more in depth. So that would be super welcome if you guys have specific stones or specific regions. And then we can really talk about those stories, because it's really going to be about motivating you to look into different stories, because every story, like every stone, is different, which means that it's impossible to cover all of them. So I think it would be nicer if you guys gave us some insight on, like, we want to hear about this stone or this region, and then we can really focus on that one and use that as an example.
Absolutely. Everything being said, same. And guys, if you just joined a bit later, please find the recording of this interview in our Reel section on Rapaport Jewelry Pro on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Wim, for all your insights. It's been so great. I really enjoying this series, and I'm looking forward to a fifth and final episode. Thanks to everyone who joined us for your great questions. I feel a lot of passionate people with gemstones, and I think what we've seen through everything is that it's the gems and the people in this journey, and all working together. And next time, I'm really looking forward to the gemstone stories. Thank you, Wim, and thanks to everyone who joined us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much also for the great questions and the great interaction. I think that was really wonderful that we were able to really address some of the questions that came up during the talk. And I think that made it a lot more dynamic for all of us, and a lot more interesting to see what you guys want to hear about.
And please, 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 our DM are open to you. It's, as I said, an educational series brought to you by the GIA and Rapaport to really help people to understand better this amazing journey of the gemstones from the field gemology and market and commercial side as well. So send us questions. We'd love to hear from you. And until next time, all the best.
Thank you so much. Everyone, enjoy your day.